On May 18, 1980, at 8:32 in the morning, Mount St. Helens in Washington state exploded sideways, not upward, sideways. The largest landslide in recorded history preceded the eruption by seconds, the entire north face of the mountain. 2.8 cubic kilometers of rock slid away at 150 miles per hour. The eruption that followed was the most destructive volcanic event in United States history. The blast flattened 230 square miles of old-growth forest in 4 minutes. Trees that had stood for 200 years, Douglas firs, hemlocks, mature old-growth giants were snapped and thrown flat in the same direction, like a billion matchsticks knocked over by the same hand. The ash cloud rose 15 miles into the atmosphere. Ash fell on 11 states. 300 miles away in Spokane, Washington, it was dark at noon. When the ash settled, scientists flew over the blast zone and saw nothing. Not a field of rubble, not scattered debris that would eventually recover. Nothing. Perfectly gray, perfectly still, uniformly dead. 230 square miles of absolute obliteration in which not a single living plant remained upright. Not a single animal moved on the surface. Not a single root broke through the sealed gray concrete of the ash layer above. Every ecological model said the same thing. Primary succession from sterile substrate. Recovery. Time. Decades. Possibly a century. Then a field ecologist named Michael Allen walked into the blast zone, and he noticed something moving under the ash. The northern pocket gopher, Thamamys talpoides, is not a glamorous animal. It is roughly the size of a russet potato. Its eyes are small and its vision is poor. It has enormous external cheek pouches, the pouches that give it its name, that it uses to carry food back to underground storage chambers. It spends virtually its entire life underground, surfacing rarely, foraging at night when it does emerge, and otherwise doing exactly one thing with extraordinary commitment: digging. A single pocket gopher can move the equivalent of a ton of soil per year, not metaphorically, literally. One animal, 1 ton per year. Moving through the earth with the focused, relentless efficiency of a biological drill that never stops and never tires. Pushing soil up, pulling organic material down, aerating, mixing, redistributing everything it passes through. In a normal forest, Ts is usevul. In a volcanic blast zone, buried under sterile ash. It is, as the scientists who eventually studied it described, transformative. The northern pocket gopher had survived the eruption, not despite being underground, because of it. While everything on the surface was incinerated in seconds, the gophers were in their tunnels, insulated from the blast by several feet of soil above them. When the ash settled and the heat dissipated, they were still there, alive, surrounded by the pre-eruption soil they had been living in, with an entire altered landscape above them that they did not yet understand and did not need to understand. They just did what gophers do. They started digging upward. This is where the experiment began, and it was an experiment deliberate and documented, though it did not look like one at the time. In 1980 and 1981, ecologists, including Michael Allen of the University of California, Riverside, identified areas within the blast zone where small amounts of pre-eruption soil were being pushed to the surface through gopher activity. The gray ash was being punctured and broken by mounds of darker, richer material from below. The gophers were, in the language the researchers would later use, acting as biological drills, mixing the sterile, nutrient-locked ash with the living soil beneath it. The researchers decided to test what would happen if they amplified this process deliberately. They captured pocket gophers from the surrounding region, animals adapted to exactly this landscape, and released them into specific plots within the blast zone. Then they set up control plots with no gophers. Then they watched both for decades. One team's intervention lasted exactly 1 day. 24 hours of gopher activity in a defined area. Then the animals were removed and the plots were left alone. 44 years later, the difference between the gopher plots and the control plots is visible to the naked eye. The gopher areas are forest. The control areas are not. To understand why, you need to understand what volcanic ash actually is and what it does to the soil beneath it. The ash from Mount St. Helens was not inherently fertile. The popular image of volcanic soil as rich and productive describes what happens decades or centuries after an eruption, when weathering and biological activity gradually unlock the mineral nutrients locked in the ash matrix. Fresh volcanic ash is chemically hostile to plant life. When it first falls, it is sterile, or nearly so, and essentially free of soluble nutrients. The ash also has little water-retaining capacity and erodes. Chemical and biological processes are required to release nutrients and contribute organic matter to sustain food webs. Fresh ash deposited in thick layers acts, in the short term, as a physical and chemical barrier. It seals the soil surface. It blocks light and water infiltration. It contains few of the microbial communities, the bacteria, the fungi, the vast invisible architecture of living soil that plants require to establish. Seeds that blow in from surrounding forests land on ash. They germinate. Then they die because the ash below them contains nothing that a seedling root can use. This is what blocked ecological recovery in the Mount St. Helens blast zone for the first years after the eruption. Not the absence of seeds. There were seeds. Not the absence of water. Washington is wet. The absence of the living soil that those seeds needed. The gophers had the solution, literally underground. As surviving gophers tunneled, they mixed underlying soil with volcanic ash. Roots and seeds flourished in the mixed soil ash layer. That sentence, from the U.S. Forest Service's own research summary, is the entire mechanism in 22 words. But what it describes took decades of careful science to fully understand, and the understanding that emerged was more interesting than anyone initially expected. Scientists hoped the gophers would help restore the ecosystem with their natural digging activities and defecation, which would fertilize and aerate the soil and bring in microorganisms like bacteria and fungi. The bacteria and fungi were the key. Specifically, mycorrhizal fungi, the underground networks that fuse with plant roots and extend far into surrounding soil, trading nutrients for sugars, making it possible for plants to access phosphorus, nitrogen, and water far beyond what their own root systems could reach. The blast had sterilized the surface, but deep in the pre-eruption soil, the gophers had been living in before the eruption. Mycorrhizal networks had survived. They were dormant, trapped below the ash layer, waiting for a connection to the surface that nothing could provide. Biologists estimate that one pocket gopher can move the equivalent of a ton of soil per year, which helped bring beneficial bacteria and fungi that survived the eruption closer to the surface. The gophers were not just mixing soil and ash. They were acting as biological elevators, lifting the living infrastructure of the pre-eruption ecosystem up through the ash layer and delivering it to the surface where seeds could reach it. When seeds blew into gopher-disturbed areas and their roots penetrated a few centimeters down, they hit a soil layer that contained mycorrhizal fungi. The fungi connected. The plants established. The plants produced organic matter. The organic matter improved the soil further. More plants established. The recovery cascaded. Closer analysis in a new paper, published more than 4 decades after the eruption, points to smaller heroes, fungi and microbes, that the gophers helped unlock. The gophers were the mechanism. The fungi were the engine. Neither worked without the other. And the scientists who placed those gophers in the blast zone in 1980 and 1981, intending only to test a short-term hypothesis, had accidentally initiated a 44-year experiment that demonstrated something fundamental about how ecosystems actually recover and how they can be helped to recover faster. The paper, published in late 2024, more than 4 decades after the eruption, quantified what had previously been visible but unmeasured. At the time, the idea raised eyebrows. Releasing burrowing rodents on an active volcano to stimulate ecological recovery was not standard practice. Ecologists had models. The models set primary succession. The slow colonization of sterile substrate by pioneer species was the only way forward, and it took time that could not be shortened. The gophers shortened it dramatically. The plots where gophers had been active in 1980 and 1981 showed measurably greater soil complexity, greater plant diversity, greater mycorrhizal network density, and more advanced forest succession than control plots without gopher activity. Those are still fresh. Baby, newborn soils, said lead author Mia Moltes, a soil microbial ecologist at the University of Connecticut. Even now, after 44 years, the soils in the blast zone are geologically young. But in the gopher plots, they are young soils with a living infrastructure that most primary succession soils take far longer to develop. The implication for restoration ecology is significant. Researchers now ask what a gopher-style intervention might look like elsewhere, using native burrowing animals to kickstart soil mixing in degraded areas, actively transplanting microbe-rich soils into sterile landscapes, protecting existing mycorrhizal networks during logging or construction. These are not radical ideas. They are extensions of what the gophers at Mount St. Helens demonstrated, that ecological recovery is not simply a function of time, but of the presence of the biological infrastructure needed to make recovery possible, and that sometimes that infrastructure can be moved. Mount St. Helens is, today, one of the most intensively studied ecological recovery sites on Earth. It is often called nature's laboratory. Scientists have been documenting its recovery continuously since 1980, producing decades of data on how ecosystems respond to catastrophic disturbance that has reshaped entire fields of ecology. The biggest surprise was not the speed of recovery, it was the mechanism. Early models had assumed recovery would be driven by wind-dispersed seeds landing on bare substrate and slowly building soil over decades. What actually happened was more complex and more surprising. The importance of biological legacies and promoting recovery emerged as an epiphany from long-term ecological research at Mount St. Helens. Biological legacies, the organisms, soil structures, and organic material that survived the eruption and protected microsites drove recovery faster and more successfully than colonization from outside. The gophers underground, the seeds in the soil beneath the ash, the mycorrhizal fungi in root zones, protected by depth and snowpack. Recovery did not start from zero. It started from whatever survived. And the job of the ecologist, and in this case, the gopher, was to reconnect what survived to the surface. The northern pocket gopher did not know it was restoring a forest. It was doing what pocket gophers do, moving through the earth, carrying soil upward, following tunnels that its instincts told it to dig. In the process, it was performing a function that no human restoration program had: the scale, the cost efficiency, or the biological precision to replicate. Bringing them there was like bringing a mini ecosystem just for a short time, said lead author Mia Maltz. A mini ecosystem deployed by scientists who were not yet sure it would work. On an active volcano in 1980, 44 years later, old-growth forest is returning to areas of the Mount St. Helens blast zone. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but measurably, documentably. Significantly faster in the areas where the gophers dug. The lesson from Mount St. Helens is not that ecological recovery is simple. It is not. The full return of old growth, Douglas fir forest to the blast zone, will take centuries. And parts of the landscape will follow trajectories no one predicted. The mountain is still active. It will erupt again. But the gopher experiment demonstrated something that ecologists cite to this day. The organisms best equipped to heal a damaged landscape are almost always already there, underground, dormant, surviving in protected pockets, waiting for the connection between what was and what could be to be restored. The gopher made that connection, 1 ton of soil at a time, for a day, 44 years ago, and the forest is still coming back. If this story changed how you think about ecological recovery, about what heals a landscape after catastrophe, and how, share it. Because the gopher was never the star of anyone's nature documentary. It is a potato-shaped rodent that barely sees daylight. It digs, and then digs more, and then digs again. And what it dug at Mount St. Helens in 1980 is still, 4 decades later, producing forest. Subscribe, because the true stories are always about the animal nobody was watching.